This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. It's been almost a year since Russia began what it calls a special military operation against Ukraine. But there's little sign the war is nearing its end. Instead, both sides seem to be preparing for new offensives. What's the latest on the ground, with new tanks being sent to Ukraine from the US, Germany, and other Western nations? How will this impact the conflict? And are there still any possibilities for peace negotiations? To discuss these questions and more, I'm joined by Einar Tangen, independent current affairs commentator, Fraser Cameron, senior advisor for the European Policy Center at Brussels, and Mark Sleboda, a Moscow-based international affairs and security analyst. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. We'll start with because we are approaching obviously the 1-year anniversary. Anna, we'll start with you. What's your assessment? What do you make of the past year?
Past year has been disastrous, of course, for Ukraine. I mean, it's economically, it's seen a 30% drop in the GDP. I mean, if you start looking at Ukraine, it was around less than 5,000 per capita. In terms of GDP, it's now at about 1,000 per capita. Then you take the lives lost. Civilian lives can be more easily verified than not. It started out at a high in last March at over 3,000. It's now trending lower to under 200 for the last few months. But any civilian casualty is bad. The number of casualties, soldiers, huge. And what do we have to show for it? The amount of debt has ballooned. This is a country with less than 50 billion in GDP. It has now over 300 billion in debt. Literally, it's 7 times the amount of per capita income for each individual has a per capita debt. The war is now in a stalemate period where both sides are seeking small tactical advantages. Even if there are large advances, it's not going to solve the issue. So at this juncture, it is not looking good, and at this point, neither side seems to be willing to bend.
Mm-hmm. Mark, from Moscow point of view, what would you think about the impact on Moscow as in terms of the relationship, of course, with the Western nations, and also the battlefields we are seeing rather largely stalemate for quite some time, right?
Yeah, I don't think that there is essentially any relationship with the states of the collective West at this point. They are adversary states. The economic, political, social linkages have been cut to an absolute minimum. And even when this conflict, however long it takes, and I do not think it will be a short one, comes to an end, I do not see any advantages of restoring those linkages. I think we're looking at a great decoupling. I think that after the treachery of the Minsk agreements with both Macron and Merkel, and the head of the Putsch regime, the oligarch Petro Poroshenko, admitting that they were merely a ruse, despite being solidified in a UN Security Council resolution as the path to a political reconciliation in Ukraine after the openly West-backed Maidan Putsch overthrew the government there in 2014. The fact that they were used simply to build up a powerful proxy NATO military force in Ukraine has been openly admitted without a shred of guilt or remorse or anything of the sort that they quite obviously resulted in this conflict. Then we had the failed January 21st agreement back in 2014, and we've had the U.S. pull out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the short and intermediate range nuclear forces treaty, the open skies treaty, stepping all over the conventional armed forces in Europe treaty, the JCPOA, on and on. There is no partner trustworthy on the other side that diplomatic relations can be conducted with, where neither the Kiev Putsch regime or its Western puppeteers. So I think, unfortunately, that means that this conflict will continue until years, probably, until a decisive battlefield victory and regime change in Kiev leaves no wiggle room for continuing, the geopolitical encroachment of NATO up to Russia's borders.
Well, Fraser, if you look at the past year, what do you see as impact, on European countries in particular, because it's close geographically, and also the rest of the world?
Well, of course, it's impacted enormously on Europe, but as you say rightly, it has had an enormous impact on the rest of the world, particularly restricting food supplies that traditionally come from both Ukraine and Russia, and so many countries in the global south are suffering tremendously. So that's, the global economic impact. But politically, I think we really have to just stop and think. This is the first time since 1945 that the country has actually invaded another neighboring country. This is not a special military operation. This is a fundamental breach of international law. It's an invasion of a sovereign country, and we should remember that. So I think that, where I agree with other speakers, this is going to be a long, protracted conflict, but certainly it's one that Ukraine ultimately will win, because Ukraine is a sovereign state, and you cannot base international relations on the rule of the might and simply allowing people to trample international rules. That's a fundamental principle.
Fraser, people often point to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. If you say this is the first time like Russia invading another sovereign nation, and also, and it's but not.
You can agree with that analysis that America was wrong to carry out the operation in Iraq. That doesn't give any other country the right to actually invade a neighboring country. Two wrongs don't make a right.
No, probably equally wrong, you can say in that sense.
Just
go ahead.
Interject.
Yeah.
Fraser, I understand your point, and I agree. I don't like conflict, but everybody in the United States who had any stature, going from Kissinger to Kiernan, over many, many years, said absolutely, if you go into Ukraine, there will be conflict with Russia. So knowing that, and then going in there and then saying, well, it's up to Ukraine, who knows what was going to happen. It can be seen as absolutely deliberate when you know the consequences of what's going in. And I rarely hear that mentioned by the European side.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean by going into Ukraine, Anna.
What I mean by is expanding NATO. Once you start rattling Russia's cage, they will respond, and they have in the past. So this idea that everybody was surprised that Ukraine is in the midst of a war seems extremely disingenuous. All right, how else would they expect Russia to react? I mean, everybody, as I said, the leading statesmen of our time said categorically, including the current president of the United States, Biden, and the head of the CIA, if you go into Ukraine with NATO and we expand into there, that will lead to war. And I just don't hear that from the Europeans. They keep saying, well, this is terrible, it's a sovereign country, how could this have happened? Well, it happened because...
But Ukraine is not a member of NATO.
It is not a member of NATO, and that's the whole point. NATO was expanding in there, although Ukraine had absolutely no ability.
Let's say, obviously, we are talking about NATO's expansion. 5 rounds of expansion after the disintegration of the former Soviet Union. Mark, how is NATO expansion or possible, Ukraine's NATO membership is seen in Moscow, for example? Is that how big a threat, or is that a threat at all?
Okay, I mean, of course, NATO is the most aggressive and powerful military alliance in the world, despite the fantasy world that is suddenly concerned with the sovereignty of other countries, neglecting, of course, Iraq, Afghanistan, Serbia, Libya, Syria, Jamaica twice. I mean, the list goes on and on. NATO was certainly involved in the attack on Libya and the carving up of Serbia, backing the terrorist Kosovo Liberation Army, and carving a little NATO protectorate out of Serbia. I mean, these are facts. These are indisputable facts. I appreciate the concern for Ukraine's sovereignty, only it's a pity that that concern didn't exist when European and US politicians were flying in to cheer on crowds that they were funding in Ukraine, calling for revolution in the country. Leading up to the openly West-backed Maidan Putsch in 2014. If only they had valued Ukraine's sovereignty before they helped overthrow the government, some of this, perhaps all of it, might have been averted. But the history of NATO and its member states as aggressive, proponents of U.S. global hegemony, using their militaries with impunity around the world for the last 3 decades. Of course, it's a threat, and it's not even literal NATO membership. The West, as we know from Merkel and Macron, NATO was building up a powerful military targeted at Russia in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. They were de facto a NATO member. NATO members were setting up military bases there. This is a near perfect parallel to what the U.S. is doing with the Chinese province of Taiwan, where they are creating a powerful military force there. They're promoting actual separatism against a part of China that they even agree is a part of China. And this is all in line with the broader, U.S.-led hegemony's broader geopolitical strategy of identifying its peer adversaries, its possible competitors, and creating what Rand Corporation calls a pressure cooker of hostile states erected by hook and crook around them to keep military and economic pressure in hopes of overthrowing their governments.
Okay,
and this is precisely the case. So, of course, NATO expansion is a threat to Russia, and anyone who suggests otherwise is not being honest.
Okay, let's leave aside the NATO expansion for another day, probably. Cameron, Fraser, if you look at the current state, obviously, we are seeing more tanks are being sent to Ukraine, and the Ukrainian ambassador to France, I believe, said that they have received 300 tanks right now. Tell us, what about the timing, and will the assistance of tanks, from Germany or from US, to what degree that will affect, that will probably impact the situation on the battlefields?
I don't think anyone knows exactly what the impact will be. I mean, Russia has overwhelming power in terms of numbers, both infantry, in terms of tanks, in terms of aircraft. So essentially, what Ukraine has been asking for is supplies to counter any Russian offensive, and that's what has been happening there. So I think nobody can say exactly what the impact will be. I think, there's no end of this conflict in sight. It's going to be very long, very protracted, and a disaster for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Anna, when are we expecting a spring offensive, as said by the Ukrainian officials, and probably a similar one from Russia too? So we are expecting probably a big battle in the coming month, if not weeks.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, go back to last year. I mean, the fighting was not intense around the spring because of the rains. There's a lot of mud. It's very difficult. It's easier to mine the roads, etc. So I don't know if there's going to necessarily be a big offensive. I think both sides are trying to interrupt each other's supply lines. It's very clear around all these Donetsk regions and things like this. But at the end of the day, there's been more than 8 million refugees. People are dying on both sides. Young men who have no political affiliations whatsoever, hadn't ever thought about going to war, are now in battlefields killing each other. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of concern about that. In Europe, it's like, we're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. The same attitude in the United States. I mean, this is about principle. Well, you know what? It's not about principle. It's about human beings. And at this juncture, I be expecting Europe to be saying it's time to have a diplomatic solution, given that a military one is not apparent. No one on this panel today says, oh yeah, this war can be wound up in a jiffy if there's just one more battle. This isn't like the movies. There isn't going to be a big final showdown. This is going to be a long, protracted war that kills people. Mm-hmm. So we need diplomacy at this juncture, not more saber rattling and tanks, which are completely ineffective. It takes a tremendous supply line to supply all of these things. You have different munitions for different tanks. You have different, repairs, everything like that, maintenance. Mm-hmm. I mean, and then there's the training of actually using them. So this is more about
time-consuming. It will take some time, right?
It takes some time.
We will talk about the solution or the end game, for this war. But before that, Fraser also, the Ukrainian side, after receiving the confirmation of attacks from Germany, U.S., and other European nations, now they are asking for fighter jets, for example, F-16 and other missiles, long-range missiles from the United States, for example. Are we seeing basically, again, more arms are going to be sent to Ukraine?
Well, both America and Germany have said no, but I mean, this could change in due course depending on what happens on the battlefield, because essentially what the West is saying, we don't want to be in a situation where we're allowing the Russian forces to overwhelm Ukraine, and simply we want to provide them with arms to ensure that they can retain control of their own territory, nothing more than that. So I think that essentially is where the debate will go. What will happen when the tanks arrive? How will the surface-to-air missiles that Ukraine already has perform in terms of dealing with the overwhelming force of the Russian Air Force? And perhaps there will be pressure later on for sending jets. But ultimately, I agree with Anna, there's no point in simply fueling this with more and more arms, because ultimately there has to be a solution. And I think the problem for Moscow is quite simply, why are you going to have a long-term conflict with a very important brother ally, 40 million Ukrainians, on your doorstep? What is the point of that? I really don't see it. So I think, any initiative is going to have to come from Moscow to try and resolve this.
Mm-hmm. If probably when we are tired of this confrontation, we will try probably harder to find a solution or peaceful solution. But right now, what we are seeing is, NATO Military Committee Chair Robert Boer basically said that we are ready for a military confrontation with Russia, and you have this German foreign minister saying that we are at war with Russia. Are we seeing NATO more and more directly or indirectly involved in this ongoing conflict, Fraser?
There's no desire for any conflict with Russia on the NATO side. But I think, it is important that countries look around and take a dispassionate look. I mean, why are Sweden and Finland wanting to join NATO? Because they've seen, the Russian aggression, and they say we're safer inside this larger alliance than being on our own. So, I mean, they're not exactly warmongering countries, Sweden and Finland. They have a very strong international relationship with the rest of the world, but that's the conclusion they have come to. So I think the answer to many of these questions lies essentially with one man, and that's Vladimir Putin in Moscow. He was the one who started this war, and he's the one who has to finish it.
Mm-hmm. The former Russian president and the current deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, Mr. Medvedev, he said basically in response to the NATO's offering of more weapons to Ukraine, that a defeat of Russia in Ukraine could trigger a nuclear war. So Mark, and how serious is him, and how likely we are going to see that kind of scenario?
Yeah, that's not that is meant for deterrence and bluster to try to deter further NATO escalation, but it is toothless. Russia has a very clear nuclear doctrine. It is not going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. There are no conditions unless its own forces there were attacked with a nuclear attack, well, like from the only country in the world that has used nuclear weapons on another country, the United States. That is the only scenario. The only other scenario is an overwhelming NATO conventional attack such that threaten the existence of the Russian state itself in Moscow or St. Petersburg, which is frankly the performance of NATO military equipment and planning on the battlefield of Ukraine, they're not even capable of. Russia has more than enough conventional force to end this conflict decisively, even if it is one that, since it is fighting all of NATO at this point, all of NATO's military and economic might. And I mean, NATO is providing all of the arms of its proxy regime in Kiev at this point. It is providing all of the ammunition, the artillery shells. It is providing them satellite intelligence, providing them C4 ISR. It is funding their entire economy at this point. It is providing all of their fuel. It is doing their wargaming and planning for them. There is literally, you can't get any closer to being a finger puppet and proxy than the U.S. is doing with the Kiev regime. And I mean, this sentiment that Russia has put itself at war with a brother people. Ukraine is a country where there's a civil conflict that has been going on for 9 years because of the U.S.-backed putsch regime in Kiev, has been mass murdering its own people. It's a part of the country where I have family in the last 9 years, and no one cared about their deaths, right? So
okay,
there
that's the
are
eastern part of
tens
Ukraine,
of
right?
thousands of Ukrainians fighting on the Russian side in this conflict. The Kiev regime has been imprisoning and extrajudicially executing on at least several known occasions thousands of what it calls collaborators in its own country. Why? Because this putsch regime does not have the support of the certainly not a representative support of the Ukrainian people. It is this regime in Kiev, backed by the West, that Russia entered the Ukrainian civil conflict and started at war with, but now it is at war with NATO.
Einar, Biden, U.S. President Biden previously said no to a possibility of sending tanks to Ukraine, and now he said yes. And now he's saying no to the F-16. Can we say, he will be consistent on that?
Well, I think it will, because it's virtually impossible. If you think it's hard to put a Abrams tank into the field and support it with munitions and upkeep, etc., try an an advanced fighter aircraft. These things, I mean, they have to walk the runways to make sure there's no specks of metal on them that could be sucked up into the air intakes. They take dedicated crews to maintain and keep them up, armaments, etc. That would all take a dedicated pipeline. Then you have the issue about pilots. It takes years to train one. So I don't know exactly how this is. I mean, countries are saying, "Oh, we'll lend you ours." I don't know how you lend a military aircraft like that. And quite frankly, the time has passed. If you start looking at what's actually happening on the ground, it's drones and missiles that are ruling the air. You have not seen 1,000 plus highly trained Russian pilots flying active missions since the very beginning. It's been using much cheaper munitions and ways of doing this war.
So we can say basically, even with F-16s, it takes a lot of time probably to make it that operational. Let's take a look at the U.S. domestic, public opinions, and about a quarter of Americans surveyed under a recent U.S. poll now says the U.S. is providing too much support to Ukraine, while 31% say it is giving the right amount, and 20% would like to see the U.S. giving more to Ukraine. Basically, 6% of the people saying it's enough or too much. And also, if you look at the Republicans, basically they are more unwilling probably than the Democrats to see this ongoing Ukraine war as a threat to the U.S. And we know that 2024 there will be a presidential election. What if there's a Republican president? How likely the U.S. will change its policy toward Ukraine?
Well, the only thing you can be certain of is if there's a change of parties in power, you're going to get a backtrack on everything that their predecessors did. So, I mean, at this juncture, you can be certain that the Republicans will make funding in Ukraine a political issue. It's difficult to know exactly how that will go, and I think a lot of it depends on the economy. If the American people start feeling the pinch, that number you said, that quarter, that's up 7% over the last couple of months. As times get harder, and if there is in fact a hard landing and a deep recession, you're going to have people saying, as they are in Europe, look, we understand they have problems, we have problems here, and we have to solve ours before we can help somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Well, Fraser, one European parliamentarian, basically from Belgium, said that sanctions against Russia had so far failed to produce the intended result of punishing Russia, quote unquote, by weakening its economy. In his words, 9 packages of sanctions and the effects is less than 0. So if sanctions failed to work, and sending tanks and probably the fighter jets will not work either, and President Putin from Russia refusing to back down, what's the solution? What's the way forward?
It's a stalemate. I mean, there is no solution in sight because of the political dynamics of the situation. I mean, President Zelensky obviously cannot accede to Russian demands. President Putin doesn't want to give in, having started this war. He has to get something out of it, he believes. So there is no condition for a negotiated settlement at the present time. So regrettably, it will go on. I mean, sanctions rarely have a big impact on any country. It's more a political gesture to say, look, given what you have done, we don't think we can continue business as usual, and therefore you cannot have access to our financial markets, you cannot visit Western countries, etc., etc. So nobody expects, that sanctions alone will bring Russia to its knees, or any other country, in fact.
Mm-hmm. Mark, less than 1 minute, what does Moscow see as the solution forward?
Yeah, regime change in Kiev. I don't
what
think
about a peaceful,
realistically there.
What about dialogue with Kiev?
Dialogue with who? The state,
with
the regime
President Zelensky,
that has been killing its own people for 9 years and created a fictition of a Minsk agreement that they carried on for 9 years while building up a powerful military, which Merkel and Macron and Poroshenko have all admitted to. There is no possibility of dialogue. There is no trustworthy partner to conduct dialogue with. This will be settled on the battlefield. It will be ended on the battlefield. Russia has the capability to demilitarize the Kiev regime in Ukraine and all of NATO in the process, in a land-centric war fought in Ukraine.
Right, and maybe a win on battlefields for Moscow, but finally we have to sit at the negotiation table and find a way forward.
There is no other way, and I really resent this idea that we just give up because nothing's possible. If you say nothing's possible, nothing is in fact possible. And in this idea that it's going to be won on the battlefield that Mark is advancing is ludicrous. It's not going to be, not without so many deaths that you will have destroyed the very country that you're, quote, trying to save. I don't care which side you're on.
Well, we have to probably, at the end of the day, talk to each other and find a solution, a peaceful solution. On that note, we concluded today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.